Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, November 1st, 2023. The Federal Reserve leaves interest rates unchanged for the second meeting in a row, but does not rule out more interest rate increases in the future. New Republican U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson meets with Senate Republicans and tells them that U.S. military aid to Israel must be voted on separately, and that a package, including money for Ukraine, Taiwan, and the U.S. southern border, as the president, most Senate Democrats, and some Senate Republicans want, cannot pass the House. We'll talk about it with Politico's defense reporter Connor O'Brien. Americans, other foreigners, and wounded Palestinians are being allowed to cross from Gaza into Egypt for the first time since the fighting began between Israel and Hamas. We'll hear from President Biden on that. The U.S. House considers a resolution to expel Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York, who has been indicted on fraud charges. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Great Britain for a summit on artificial intelligence safety, and she argues for addressing what she calls the full spectrum of AI threats, including bias, discrimination, and disinformation. And the Supreme Court hears a case over whether the phrase "Trump too small" can be trademarked without the consent of Donald Trump. From CNBC, this story: the Federal Reserve on Wednesday again held benchmark interest rates steady amid a backdrop of growing economy and labor market and inflation that is still well above the central bank's target. In a widely expected move, the Fed's rate-setting group unanimously agreed to hold the key federal funds rate in a target range between 5.25% and 5.5%, where it has been since July. This was the second consecutive meeting that the Federal Open Market Committee chose to hold following a string of 11 rate hikes, including 4 in 2023. That reporting from CNBC. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell made the announcement in a news conference.
Since early last year, we have raised our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points, and we have decreased our securities holdings by more than $1 trillion. Our restrictive stance of monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. The committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. We are committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation sustainably down to 2% over time, and to keeping policy restrictive until we are confident that inflation is on a path to that objective. We are attentive to recent data showing the resilience of economic growth and demand for labor. Evidence of growth persistently above potential, or that tightness in the labor market is no longer easing, could put further progress on inflation at risk and could warrant further tightening of monetary policy. Financial conditions have tightened significantly in recent months, driven by higher, longer-term bond yields, among other factors. Because persistent changes in financial conditions can have implications for the path of monetary policy, we monitor financial developments closely. In light of the uncertainties and risks and how far we have come, the committee is proceeding carefully.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, part of his opening statement at today's news conference. From NBC, since the Federal Reserve's last meeting in September, new data has showed that inflation is continuing to gradually come down. It's still not clear if it's coming down fast enough or if it will continue to decline and get to the 2% annual level the Fed says it wants to see. Projections by members of the Fed's Open Market Committee, which makes decisions about raising or lowering interest rates, show that policymakers think it will take until 2025 or 2026 to get inflation to that level. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates sharply from March 2022 through the summer as it tried to get inflation under control. Inflation had hit 40-year highs in mid-2022, peaking at 9.1% annually. By contrast, that rate was 3.7% in September. That's how NBC News reported it. Reporter asked Fed Chair Powell about possible future interest rate hikes. Another reporter asked him about a possible recession.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you so much for taking our questions. I wonder, if you don't raise interest rates in December, would the presumption be that at that point that we should expect that rates are at their peak, or is there a possibility of restarting rate increases next year? And are there any costs to taking a more extended pause?
So Let me start by saying we haven't made a decision about September. You're asking a hypothetical there, but we're going into the December meeting. We'll get, as you know, 2 more inflation readings, 2 more labor market readings, some data on economic activity, and so we'll be taking, and also the broader situation, the broader financial conditions situation, and the broader world situation. We'll be looking at all those things as we make a decision in December. We haven't made that decision. I would say, though, that the idea that the idea that you would be difficult to raise again after stopping for a meeting or two is just not right. I mean, the committee will always do what it thinks is appropriate at the time. And again, we haven't made any decisions at all about December. We didn't talk about making a decision in December today. Really, it was a decision for this meeting and understanding broader things.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, did the Fed staff put a recession back into the baseline forecast in the materials for today's meeting? And how much does this tightening in financial conditions substitute for rate hikes if the tightening is persistent? You had said it was worth maybe a quarter point when we had the bank failures in the spring. What is it here on something that's presumably more straightforward and more familiar to simulate?
So I guess I don't want to answer your question about the recession, but the answer is no. I think I have to answer it since we did publicly say in the minutes. You'll know anyway in the minutes. The staff did not put a recession back in. I mean, it would be hard to see how you would do that if you look at the activity we've seen recently, which is not really indicative of a recession in the near term. In terms of how to think about translation into rate hikes, I think it's just too early to be doing that. And the main reason is we just don't know how persistent this will be. You can see how volatile it is. Different kinds of news will affect the level of rates. And I think any kind of an estimate that was, precise would hang out there and have a great chance of looking wrong very quickly. So I think what we can say is that financial conditions have clearly tightened, and you can see that in the rates that consumers and households and businesses are paying now. And over time, that will have an effect. We just don't know how persistent it's going to be, and it's tough to try to translate that in a way that I'd be comfortable communicating into how many rate hikes that is.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at a news conference today. You can find the video of it in its entirety at our website, cspan.org. Dow up 221, NASDAQ up 210, S&P up 44. The story from thehill.com, new Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, told Republican senators Wednesday that U.S. military aid to Israel must move by itself, warning them that a larger package also funding Ukraine, Taiwan, and the southern border can't pass the House. Speaker Johnson also told GOP members that he supports sending military aid to Ukraine, but cautioned it must be attached to reforms to improve border security. He told senators that he plans to move an Israel aid bill and a Ukraine border security bill sequentially, according to GOP senators who attended the meeting. That was from The Hill. Senator John Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming, a member of the Senate GOP leadership, spoke to reporters ahead of the meeting with Speaker Johnson.
Senator, can we quickly just ask you about this Mike Johnson House bill that's going to be voted on tomorrow? The CBO score came out. Looks like it's going to actually cut revenue and increase the deficit. How do Republicans square that?
Well, we're going to be meeting with the Speaker at lunch today, the Republican conferences, so that'll be an opportunity to talk about those things. I clearly am fully in support of Israel. I want to make sure they have what they need. But as you know, I just got back from a trip to the border. The southern border is not secure. I think we are at an increased risk of terrorism right now in the United States as a result of the policies of this administration. And I have a commitment to making sure that any large piece of legislation that can actually pass includes securing the southern border. Not more money to make people come in faster, which is what the administration wants to do, or send money to sanctuary cities, but specifically to stop the flow of illegal immigrants.
But what's your initial gut feeling right now on just an aid package that would actually increase the deficit?
As you know, the funding mechanism of this proposal is to cut the spending to the IRS. Every Republican voted against this big increase of money to the Internal Revenue Service to do more audits, to look into the small businesses of the country. Now, the administration claims that that's going to be able, through their shakedown of business owners, small businesses in the United States, by shaking them down, they're going to get more money into the federal government. I don't believe that that's the right approach, and that's why I voted against that effort in the Senate, as well as every Republican in the House voted against that when the Democrats forced that through. So I support defunding the IRS, taking that money out of that as a source of payment for the money to Israel. I want to make sure Israel has what they need to fight the war they need to fight.
Senator John Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming. Politico's defense reporter Connor O'Brien has been tracking the debate over the president's request for aid to Israel, Ukraine, Indo-Pacific, and the U.S.-Mexico border. He joins us now live. Thanks for being with us. The new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, meets today with the Senate Republicans on this and other issues. What are we hearing about how that went?
There was some discussion, obviously, about how to deal with President Biden's $106 billion request for Israel, Ukraine, the Asia Pacific, deterring China, and border security funding. And the House and the Senate are approaching this from differing kind of perspectives. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, has really aligned himself with Biden to push a united package, primarily keeping Ukraine and Israel together. What we kind of got from this was Johnson, who is just a couple weeks on the job and really is facing confronting a government funding deadline in just a couple of weeks, and also has this supplemental package to deal with. Is going to move these things separately, is going to move Israel funding separately. And that seems to be what he communicated there. But that he also views Ukraine and border security. And in this case, I think it's usually I think it's kind of taken to mean border security policy, changes to the policy at the border. Is linked with Ukraine funding. I believe, according to one of my colleagues, Senator John Cornyn said Johnson described them as inextricably intertwined. So I think we're seeing that as perhaps there were some Republicans leaving this meeting, kind of thinking about how can you proceed on these two tracks, but I do think a lot of Republicans see border security policy as the kind of holy grail to unlocking Ukraine money.
If I can interpret what you're saying, it looks like the speaker still plans to move forward with the Israel-only funding bill, but we're not sure what's going to happen when it hits the Senate.
So Republicans are planning, Mike Johnson is planning to move an Israel-only bill. And it does look like it's going to be a largely party line, measure, just the Israel funding, but then cuts to IRS funding to in an attempt to offset that. But that's upset Democrats, and that's a no-go in the Senate. The majority leader Chuck Schumer has already ruled that out. Said it's not a serious proposal. We still need to see what the Senate is going to produce. Obviously, it's going to work its own will on the president's request. But the Senate Appropriations Committee had a hearing yesterday on the National Security Supplemental, and so I would expect in the next week or so for that to kind of take shape. But it does look like Senator Schumer, Senator McConnell are going to push for a united proposal. And can they get that passed? Can they get 60 votes? I think is still TBD because McConnell and Republicans are pushing hard on the border security aspect, and so so it remains I think unclear what the combination is that's going to get broad bipartisan support. And then when that goes back to the House, what do they do there?
We're talking with Politico's Connor O'Brien. The Congressional Budget Office has come out with an analysis of what Speaker Johnson has put together. It's not only aid to Israel, but cuts the IRS budget, but CBO saying that's not revenue neutral. What effect does that have on the debate?
It gives Democrats a real, I think it helps them in this debate because they can point to that this is not a real offset. What the CBO said was it would actually the entire bill, the Israel aid, which is about $14.3 billion, and then the about $14.5 billion cut from the IRS would amount to $26.8 billion added to the deficit over the next year. It would actually the cut to IRS funding would actually add $12.5 billion to the deficit because they project that as decreasing tax revenue through lessened tax collection. So I don't think that's going to change how Republicans view this. I believe Speaker Johnson was quoted as essentially saying, only in something to the effect of only in D.C. can a cut to funding actually be projected as increasing spending. But so I don't think that's. I still see it kind of Republicans kind of lining up behind this, but they tried to make it. I think it makes it less of a political trap for Democrats that they can point to this actually increases the deficit.
Connor O'Brien covers defense policy for Politico. Find his stories at Politico.com and on X, formerly Twitter, at Connor O'Brien NH. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
The White House issued Tuesday night a veto threat about that House Republican bill that has aid only for Israel and the cuts to the IRS funding. It reads in part that the Republican bill inserts partisanship into support for Israel, making our ally a pawn of our politics. In a moment, we must stand together. It denies humanitarian assistance to vulnerable populations around the world, including Palestinian civilians, which is a moral and strategic imperative, and by requiring offsets for this critical security assistance, it sets a new and dangerous precedent by conditioning assistance for Israel, further politicizing our support and treating one ally different from others. This bill is bad for Israel, for the Middle East region, and for our own national security. Part of the statement from the White House, called an SAP or SAP, stands for Statement of Policy, a veto threat against the House Republican bill. A reporter asked a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, John Kirby, about it. The two were flying on Air Force One.
Your SAP on the supplemental had strong language. It had the word veto, and it also really went off on the offsets dealing with IRS enforcement, blah, blah, blah. So my question is, will the president sign a clean, non-offset Israel package?
I won't get ahead of the president and what he will sign. I think the statement that we put out last night speaks for itself in terms of what he won't sign. He wants to see this supplemental request approved in full because he believes that all of those priorities are significant, urgent national security priorities. And the key word there is urgent. I mean, that's what this is. This is an urgent supplemental because every situation that he talked about is increasingly important for our national security. So again, I won't get ahead of what may end up on his desk or what he will sign or he won't. I think he's been very clear about what he won't sign.
John Kirby is Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, doing a news conference on Air Force One. President Biden posting today on X, "Today, thanks to American leadership, we secured safe passage for wounded Palestinians and for foreign nationals to exit Gaza. We expect American citizens to exit today, and we expect to see more depart over the coming days. We won't let up working to get Americans out of Gaza." The border crossing between Gaza and Egypt is at a place called Rafah. The president spoke about this while in Minnesota today.
Before I start today, I'd like to say a few words about the latest developments in the Gaza Strip in Israel. Today, thanks to concerted American leadership, we're in a situation where safe passage for wounded Palestinians and foreign nationals to exit Gaza has started. The American citizens are able to exit today as part of the first group of probably over 1,000. We'll see more of this process going on in the coming days. We're working nonstop to get Americans out of Gaza as soon and as safely as possible. This is the result of intense and urgent American diplomacy with our partners in the region. I personally spent a lot of time speaking with the Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and the President Sisi of Egypt and others to make sure that we could open this access for people to get out. I want to thank our partners in the region, and particularly Qatar, who've worked so closely with us to support negotiations to facilitate the departure of these citizens. At the same time, we're continuing working to significantly step up the flow of critical humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The number of trucks entering Gaza continues to increase significantly, but we still have a long way to go. The United States is going to continue to drive humanitarian support for innocent people in Gaza who need help, and they do need help. We're going to continue to affirm that Israel has the right to and responsibility to defend its citizens from terror, and it needs to do so in a manner that is consistent with international and humanitarian law that prioritizes the protection of citizens. We've all seen the devastating images from Gaza. Palestinian children crying out for lost parents, parents reasoning and writing their children's names on their hands and legs to be identified if the worst happens. It's okay. Kids are allowed to do that with me. Okay? Don't worry about it, all right? I don't blame her. Is it him or her? I don't blame her. Look, the loss of every innocent life is a tragedy. We grieve for those deaths and continue to grieve for the Israeli children and mothers who were brutally slaughtered by Hamas terrorists, and also continue to hold in our hearts the hundreds of families and loved ones, including small children and elderly grandparents, including American citizens being held hostage. My administration continues to work around the clock to reunite those families. We're not going to give up, period. We're not going to give up. And I am optimistic, but then I am an optimist.
President Biden in Northfield, Minnesota today, the start of an event on a different subject. He was there to talk about the rural economy, visiting a family farm, and announcing more than $5 billion in investments in rural America. Also, a note that Northfield, Minnesota is in the congressional district represented by Democrat Angie Craig, who won re-election in 2022 with just 51% of the vote, and it's right next to the district of Congressman Dean Phillips, another Democrat who is now running for president, challenging President Biden for his party's nomination. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said at a news conference when asked about the Americans, the other foreign nationals, and the wounded Palestinians now exiting Gaza, that he did not have a precise number of how many Americans have left, but he said there are about 400 Americans in Gaza who the State Department has been in communication with and have expressed a desire to leave. The website commondreams.org, which describes itself as providing news to the progressive community, writes that with over 8,500 Palestinians already killed in Israel's war on the Gaza Strip, Senator Bernie Sanders took to the Senate floor on Wednesday to argue that the priority right now must be to stop the bombing and bring in as much humanitarian aid as possible. Article goes on that Senator Sanders again advocated for a humanitarian pause or a temporary halt to hostilities for delivery of essentials and possible evacuations rather than calling for a ceasefire or a long-term suspension of fighting, which a small group of progressive House Democrats and people worldwide, including hundreds of staffers from his presidential campaigns, have been demanding. Again, that was the article as written by the group, by the website commondreams.org. Here is part of what Senator Sanders said today on the Senate floor.
The humanitarian crisis is dire and getting worse by the minute. There must be a humanitarian pause now so that sufficient supplies, food, water, medicine, fuel, can reach the people of Gaza. If not, thousands more will die needlessly. We cannot allow that to happen. A stop to the bombing is critical to save innocent lives and secure the safe return of hostages. Mr. Mr. President, let us never forget the lives of all children. All people are sacred, whether they are Palestinian children, Israeli children, or American children, and we must do everything we can to protect them. But, Mr. President, if we are going to make any real progress in addressing this never-ending conflict between Israel and Hamas, there have been 5 wars in the last 15 years. We need to understand somewhat as to how we got to where we are today. If peace is to come to that troubled region, and if the Palestinian people are ever going to be able to enjoy lives of security and dignity, there must be a vision of where we go in the future. So let us be clear. The living conditions in Gaza before October 7th were horrific and inhumane. And that is before Hamas ignited the latest war.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, today on the Senate floor. A story from Reuters, President Joe Biden's support among Arab Americans, who are crucial voters in battleground election states, has plunged from a comfortable majority in 2020 to just 17%, a new poll shows, amid growing anger over the Democratic president's support for Israel's attacks on Gaza. Arab American support for Joe Biden at 59% in 2020 fell even before the outbreak of violence in the Middle East to 35%. The poll commissioned by the Arab American Institute showed, but has halved since. That from Reuters. The poll was released Tuesday, and the article says it marks the first time since its inception in 1997 that a majority of Arab Americans did not identify as Democrats. 32% now identify as Republicans, 31% as independents. The White House Deputy Press Secretary, Emily Simons, was asked about this while she and the press flew on Air Force One.
I know the White House doesn't want to respond to every poll, but given the dramatic drop in support for President Biden among Muslim and Arab Americans, is the administration concerned about how the messages you're sending surrounding the conflict are being received by some communities?
So once again, we deeply understand that these communities are hurting and how deeply they feel what's going on overseas and how communities here at home, both in the form of Islamophobia, in the form of concern about family and friends, innocent civilians that are affected overseas. And that's why at every opportunity, we're going to continue having these conversations at the highest level between the President and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the President and El-Sisi of Egypt, yesterday, the President and the King of Jordan. And we're going to continue sharing that message with these communities because we know how important it is to increase the amount of aid that's flowing into Gaza and do what we can to create the conditions for a humanitarian pause.
But is there any sense that you, as an administration, need to change the way that you're communicating these things, given how they're being received?
What we think is extremely important is to continue sitting down, as we have been with these communities, hear from them directly, take their feedback, and continue to build on that. This is a living, breathing conflict, and we want to be receptive to the communities. And, you know, we're hearing from the Muslim communities every day. We look forward to, hopefully soon, rolling out new pieces of this, and so we'll keep you posted on that front.
Emily Simons is White House Deputy Press Secretary speaking with reporters on Air Force One. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A few more headlines. The Pentagon this week unveiled a new online tool for troops and other federal employees to report sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, commonly called UFOs, or information about related U.S. programs. Current and former U.S. service members, government workers, and contractors can use the online form to share their, quote, direct knowledge of alleged U.S. government programs or activities related to UAPs dating back to 1945. Two House Republicans announcing they are not seeking re-election. Kay Granger of Texas, chair of the Appropriations Committee, first elected in 1996, said she's encouraged by the next generation of leaders in my district. And Ken Buck of Colorado, who has been in Congress since 2014 and said too many Republican leaders are lying to America. The casualty list, as it's known, at Roll Call, which tracks retirements, shows in this election cycle 14 House Democrats and 7 House Republicans are retiring or seeking other office. As Congress faces a November 17th deadline to extend federal government funding or face a shutdown, the House has been working to pass all of the 12 regular fiscal year 2024 spending bills, not expecting that they would all then pass the Senate and be signed into law by the president by the deadline. There's likely going to be another temporary funding extension. But instead, the new House Speaker says it's to provide a benchmark for the House Republicans as they negotiate with the Senate and president on full-year funding levels. Today, the House debated the legislative branch spending bill. The subcommittee chair is Mark Amodei, Republican from Nevada.
The legislative branch bill, Madam Chair, is what we do to ourselves. We don't need the president's budget. This is what the House, in its wisdom, does for spending with respect to the House accounts and also some accounts we share with the Senate. Capitol Police, Congressional Budget Office, other agencies like that. So, as we look at what we're doing here in the context of this appropriation season, the amount of money that's spent on this represents about a 4.7% cut from the previous budget year for purposes of ledge branch. Gets a little bit less when you add the Senate's in, but the House has done its job in terms of leading by example. Now, you may say, how have you done your job? Let me tell you this. What we have done with respect to members' office budgets, committee budgets, and some of the support functions, for instance, in the Library of Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, and the General Accounting Office, we have left those accounts at or near what their previous levels were. Some of them enjoy modest increases, but if you care about constituent services, if you care about doing a good job of being able to hold the Senate's feet to the fire, the White House's feet to the fire, or the people on the other side of the aisle's feet to the fire, you need resources to do that. The time has never been more important than it is now for us to be able to do our jobs in a way that is appropriate for the challenges that confront our country.
Mark Amodei, Republican from Nevada, he chairs the Appropriations Subcommittee on the legislative branch, debating the fiscal year 2024 spending bill for ledge branch on the House floor today. The ranking Democrat is Adriano Espaillat from New York.
As the chairman indicated, the bill before us today includes $5.3 billion in discretionary appropriations to fund the offices of the House of Representatives and joint legislative branch items. It also has a decrease of 4.7% from fiscal year 2023 enacted House level and a 2.4% decrease in total allocations, including Senate items. This bill merely keeps the lights on, but it could and should have done so much better. Unfortunately, extreme MAGA culture provisions have haunted all 12 of our House appropriations bill. And of course, ledge branch was not spared. This bill too contains provisions that harm the division of equity and inclusion and the LGBTQ+ community. Moreover, this bill does not allow legislative branch agencies to employ individuals under the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program. young kids that are capable. They've contributed to this nation. And all they're missing is a piece of paper, but they are Americans in every word you can imagine.
Congressman Adriano Espaillat, Democrat from New York, today on the House floor. The House working on the remaining fiscal year 2024 spending bills. Today, legislative branch also scheduled for this week. Departments of Interior and the Environment and related agencies, and Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and related agencies. Over in the Senate, they're also working on fiscal year 2024 spending bills, passing the first three in a package covering Departments of Agriculture, Housing, Transportation, and Veterans Affairs. The vote in the Senate today was 82 to 15. Back to the House, the House of Representatives today taking up a resolution on whether to expel Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York, who has been indicted on 23 federal fraud counts, including using campaign donor credit cards to charge tens of thousands of dollars of purchases without authorization. He has pleaded not guilty. The expulsion resolution was introduced by 5 New York Republicans. Here is Congressman LaLota on the House floor.
George Santos thinks that we're fools, Mr. Speaker. And George Santos didn't just lie about being at Ground Zero on the day after September 11th like President Biden did. George Santos went much further, saying that his mother was in the South Tower on 9/11 and escaped only to later die from 9/11 related illness. Santos lied about his association with 9/11 to win over Long Island families of cops and firefighters and other innocent people who died on 9/11 and whose hearts were ripped out that fateful day. He did it as part of a broader scheme to defraud voters and donors to get him elected to Congress. To further defraud voters and swindle donors out of millions, George Santos even lied about being Jewish. Like his lies about his association with 9/11, Santos lied about being Jewish as part of a calculated attempt to win over voters in the district that Santos is attempting to trick, who has a strong Jewish population. George Santos says the decision of whether he should remain in Congress should be left up to the people of New York's 3rd District. I would argue these New Yorkers were robbed of this opportunity when they were duped into voting for a fictitious candidate to represent them in Congress. George Santos has stated himself that he lied about several parts of his life, including his education and his mother dying on 9/11, and today 78% of his constituents support his expulsion from Congress. George Santos also falsely claims that his expulsion is barred by the Constitution's 5th and 14th Amendments due process clauses. Yet the due process clauses do not apply to House proceedings such as expulsions. Moreover, the Constitution more broadly affords the accused the knowledge of the accusation against them, the opportunity to be heard, the ability to confront his or her accuser, and to be afforded a speedy trial. And Mr. Speaker, as of today, each of those conditions has been met. Nothing in the Constitution gives George Santos the right to endlessly stall and to abuse his office to seek a more preferable conviction or a plea deal.
Congressman Nick LaLota, Republican from New York, one of a handful of New York Republicans, debating on the House floor on a resolution to expel Congressman Santos, Republican from New York. He spoke in his defense.
Mr. Speaker, efforts taken by other members in this body to act as judge, jury, and executioner are unconscionable and reckless to our Republican system of government and to the integrity of this body. I stand today to continue to prove my innocence of these allegations and charges leveled against me. I'd like to say I understand the point of view of my colleagues, but I don't. One can't say that they are pro-Constitution and at the same time act as judge, jury, and executioner. Where is the consistency, Mr. Speaker? The actions taken within this body are delicate, and consistency is essential. And now is not the time to set dangerous precedent. Consider this. The last time a member of Congress was expelled was in 2002, following a criminal conviction. In fact, both expulsions in the last 2 centuries took place after the defendants had been convicted. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'd like to remind you that many of you are supporting another member of Congress who is under investigation and is the second time he is indicted. And even one of you, and even one who recently pleaded guilty to a crime, rather than calling for their resignation, here we are. I must warn my colleagues that voting for expulsion at this point would circumvent the judicial system's right to due process that I'm entitled to, and desanctify the long-held premise that one is presumed innocent until proven guilty. It is unconscionable to think that this body, who is at war with the DOJ over their politically motivated practices, would blindly accept their accusation against a member of another branch of government. We were each elected to Congress because our constituents supported our pledge to uphold the Constitution, protect their liberties, and put their needs first. We swore with our palms to the Bible to do so. This expulsion, unfortunately, is politically motivated by some members within this body. They believe that by attempting to expel me, they will garner political points, capitalize on political fundraising, and receive congratulations from those who do not approve of my voting record.
Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York, on the House floor on a resolution that would expel him. The U.S. Constitution requires a two-thirds vote of House members to expel one of its members, and there are currently 433 House members. There are 2 vacancies. That works out to 289 votes would be needed to expel him. According to the U.S. House Archive, 5 lawmakers in U.S. history have been expelled. The last one was 2002, Democrat James Traficant of Ohio. This is Washington Today. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, writes Reuters, on Wednesday called for urgent action to protect the public and democracy from the dangers posed by artificial intelligence, announcing a series of initiatives to address safety concerns about the technology. In a speech at the U.S. Embassy in London, Vice President Harris spoke of the dangers AI could pose for individuals and the Western political system. She called for a broader definition of AI safety to include the full spectrum of threats, including bias, discrimination, and the spread of disinformation. That was from Reuters. Vice President Harris is in London to attend the Prime Minister's AI Safety Summit.
From AI-enabled cyber attacks at a scale beyond anything we've seen before, to AI-formulated bioweapons that could endanger the lives of millions of people. These threats are often referred to as the existential threats of AI, because, of course, they could endanger the very existence of humanity. These threats, without question, are profound, and they demand global action. But let us be clear, there are additional threats that also demand our action. Threats that are currently causing harm, and which to many people also feel existential. Consider, for example, when a senior is kicked off his health care plan because of a faulty AI algorithm. Is that not existential for him? When a woman is threatened by an abusive partner with explicit, deepfake photographs, is that not existential for her? When a young father is wrongfully imprisoned because of biased AI facial recognition, is that not existential for his family? And when people around the world cannot discern fact from fiction because of a flood of AI-enabled mis- and disinformation, I ask, is that not existential for democracy? Accordingly, to define AI safety, I offer that we must consider and address the full spectrum of AI risk, threats to humanity as a whole, as well as threats to individuals communities, to our institutions, and to our most vulnerable populations. We must manage all these dangers to make sure that AI is truly safe.
Vice President Kamala Harris speaking at the U.S. Embassy in London today. President Biden earlier this week signed an executive order to govern safety and security concerns in AI development. Vice President Harris plans to attend Britain's Artificial Intelligence Safety Summit, which is running today and tomorrow. She'll be there on Thursday. It's being held at Bletchley Park. That's where top British code breakers broke Nazi Germany's Enigma code during World War II, using the world's first programmable computer. Some of the other attendees at this AI Safety Summit: Elon Musk, executives from AI companies, China's technology vice minister, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Back in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case involving whether the Patent and Trademark Office violated the First Amendment right to free speech when it refused registration of the phrase "Trump too small" on T-shirts. That phrase started as a crude joke during the 2016 Republican presidential debates between candidates Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. And the person seeking the trademark, Steve Elster, politically active Democratic attorney, he wanted to put on T-shirts, "Donald Trump's package is too small," ellipses on the environment, on civil rights, etc. NBC News writes that the application was rejected because people would associate the word Trump with then President Donald Trump. The Trademark Office concluded that Trump's written consent would be needed as required under the 1946 law called the Lanham Act. Elster argues that his free speech rights are violated if he cannot register a trademark that criticizes a public figure. But Supreme Court justices on Wednesday appeared skeptical of that claim. That was from NBC News. Here's a bit of the oral argument. Chief Justice John Roberts questioning the attorney for Steve Elster, Jonathan Taylor.
What do you do about the government's argument that you're the one who is undermining First Amendment values, because the whole point of the trademark, of course, is to prevent other people from doing the same thing? So if you win, the slogan "Trump too small" or whatever, other people can't use it, right?
Other people can't use it as a source identifier of their own, which I think is perfectly
They can't use it the way you want to use it, and you say the way you want to use it is to engage in expression. And then in trademark, there are things that are kind of close to it that are also prohibited, right? So we'll have all sorts of litigation. Presumably there'll be a race for people to trademark, Trump to this, Trump to that, whatever. And then particularly in an area of political expression, that really cuts off a lot of expression other people might regard as an important infringement on their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, so a couple of points on that, Mr. Chief Justice. I take the concern, and I think it's a fair one. I think a lot of that concern is dealt with by the requirement that a mark actually function as a mark. That means it's got to bring to mind, in the mind of the consuming public, that it functions as a source identifier. It's not just expressing a common message. It's why "God bless the United States" or "I heart DC." Those kinds of marks don't generally get registered. And I think that if in the main, many political slogans do not get registered for that very reason, and I think it addresses a lot of those concerns. So what we have to imagine is a mark that functions as a mark, and so it's kind of distinct enough and unique enough to kind of serve that purpose and satisfies all the others.
Sorry to interrupt, but if yours meets those requirements, it's hard to see what the limitation would be on all sorts of other things, except to the fact that they think it's, whatever they think is a parody or a joke. And you can certainly find most adjectives and attach them to your phrase. And, all those would be protected, and only a limited number of people would be able to make the, particular comical expression, but carrying First Amendment weight that you want to arrogate to yourself here.
I think
Chief Justice John Roberts questioning attorney Jonathan Taylor in today's Supreme Court oral argument, the case Vidal v. Elster. And you'll be able to find the full audio, it's just audio at this point, from the Supreme Court on our website at cspan.org. There was a funny moment at the end of today's case, the Chief Justice congratulating the other attorney arguing, U.S. Deputy Solicitor General Malcolm Stewart, on reaching a milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. You linger at the podium just for a moment. Our records reflect that this is was your 100th argument before the court. You are the 4th person to reach this rare milestone this century. Throughout your career, you have consistently advocated positions on behalf of the United States in an exemplary manner. I recall one case in particular from my days in private practice 23 years ago, in which I was counsel for petitioner and you argued in support of respondent. Now, when the opinion came down, I was just 9 votes short of a unanimous result for my client. On behalf of the court, I extend to you our appreciation for your advocacy before the court and dedicated service as an officer of this court. We look forward to hearing from you many more times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chief Justice.
Chief Justice John Roberts with U.S. Deputy Solicitor General Malcolm Stewart at today's oral argument. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word to get the stories making headlines emailed to you every day. It's free. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.